Do you all see the, just gonna start over real quick. So it finds the right screen. There we go. All right, well, great. Well, welcome everyone to the virtual open house on day 3 of the virtual charrette for the Datura and Evernia Streetscape project. My name is Brad Davis, and I've been overseeing the design team leading this effort to reimagine Datura and Evernia Street. We want to welcome you again, or if this is the first time, welcome, and we hope that you enjoy these ideas about improving Datura and Evernia Street. So today, we are going to explore some of the different ideas that we've been developing for these 2 streets. The first 2 days, we were developing scenarios for Datura and Evernia Street. 3 scenarios in particular include keeping the street 2-way, but just improving the existing streetscape. Another scenario looked at developing a shared street concept for both streets, but keeping it 2-way, so similar to the recent projects along Clematis and Rosemary. And the third scenario was looking at creating that shared street feel, but also converting Datura and Evernia Street to one-way pairs for vehicles. So with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to the rest of the design team to go over the agenda and present some of the concepts we've been developing. So Britt, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Britt Stork from Alta. Brad, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the project themes that have been guiding a lot of our design work. And some of you have probably seen this when you took the initial survey that went out a few weeks ago, online survey. And I'm just going to explain them a little bit. They've really helped to kind of guide and provide a framework for our work. And they're also congruent with the project goals that were established between us and the consultant team in the city. Next slide. So mobility and accessibility, when we talk about this, and you'll see these icons appear on the subsequent slide, so you'll sort of know how the ideas and concepts that we're talking about tonight will tie to the themes guiding this work. When we talk about mobility, we're talking about multi-mobility. We're talking about multimodal transportation. And great streets are inclusive of all ages, all abilities, and different modes. When our streets are supportive of all these types of uses, they're more diverse and they're more vibrant. They're places people want to be. Next slide. Culture and social activation. This refers to things that draw people into our downtowns and draw people into streets. Especially in downtowns, you can't just simply have a street and roadway network with no activation. It's important to have and use streets as public spaces. A lot of people don't realize that our streets are public space and make up a good bit of our public space within our communities. There are ways to attract people to them, which really builds community, really builds culture. And we can do this through providing seating areas, places to dine outdoors, creating spaces for people to have events or just hang out and have fun together. Next slide. Economic development. This is another one of our themes. And when it comes to streetscapes, streets are good for local businesses. They attract people to the downtowns and encourage people to stroll and walk and linger. They're also destinations in and of themselves. And when people come to downtowns and use the streets, they typically spend money at the restaurants, at the businesses that line these streets. Well-designed public spaces also, beyond just people spending, good streetscapes and well-designed downtowns attract residents, they attract businesses, which is really good for tax revenue. So that's another source of economic benefit. Next slide. When possible, we always want to design our streets with the environment in mind. There are opportunities to design with low impact, use resilient materials, green infrastructure. And just given the hot, humid climate of Florida, we're definitely exploring ways that we can cool the outdoor climate, whether that's through shade structures, street trees, water features, the goal being making people as comfortable as possible through all the seasons, even in high summer. Next slide. And finally, the art and digital interaction theme. This refers to just, the sort of the modern day technology, that world that we live in. Our team really has done a job of exploring tactically how can we integrate technology, art, and lighting within our streets. We'll show some examples of that, and as well as accommodating people's desire to use their smartphones, whether they're on vacation or just in their day-to-day life doing their business. It's important to provide for that. People socialize virtually and they want to experience things digitally and through their phones. Also, providing this type of service and design element within the streetscape is important in supporting trip planning, wayfinding, again, and attracting people to these downtown areas and streetscapes. So let's talk a little bit about the different themes and concepts. I'll hand it over to Donnie.
Thank you, Britt. I'm Donnie. I'm also with Alta. And I'll be introducing some of the themes in tandem with some of the design work we've been doing on the blocks. And yeah, let's jump in. So the first topic I wanted to really dive a little deep on is the idea of all ages programming. And it's something that's often lacking in cities. We often see cities designed for young millennials, or we'll see cities designed for families, or we'll see cities designed for kids. But a thriving downtown space really needs streets that are designed for all ages and all abilities, for that matter. So I really use the blocks on Datura from Quadrille to Dixie to look at that. The reason being is there's a new development going in on the north side of the block that would be a senior living facility. So it's a really interesting space to test out ideas for how streets can respond to that kind of development and the people who will be living there, as well as some of the other residential buildings in the area that have families and people more in their working ages. If you could go to the next slide. So this is kind of a dramatic reimagining. We were looking at what a two-way shared street concept along this block could look like. And so we really tried to concentrate a lot of thought and programming into the side of the street where the senior living facility would be going. In addition to wider sidewalks, we really wanted to imagine what is often missing from these types of facilities when they're placed in the urban realm. And one of the ideas that we were playing with is this idea of a front porch. If you think about wanting to enjoy the outdoors, but not necessarily being as mobile and being able to go far, really wanted to create a space along the edge of the building where people who live there could really use it as this space to look out over a beautiful place. So in concentrating space for people to live and interact on that north side of the street, a few of the ideas that we looked at were creating places to sit in comfort. So not just kind of conventional benches, but really thinking, what are some really playful ways we can integrate seating that is good for someone with a bad back or good for somebody in a wheelchair. Some of the other activities that we looked to get in here, some urban cooling strategies, climatic comfort, which is something I'll talk about in a little bit, but climatic comfort is really key for older populations who may be a little less adaptive to extreme heat. So wanting to create spaces that might have misting or cooling elements in them in these areas. And trying to think of other activities that could be really beneficial here. One of the key ones that jumped out is urban agriculture. It's a great program for not just for seniors, but for all ages. And it creates a green and vibrant and productive space as well. Just one additional thought to this, there's a senior living facility in Seattle that became very famous a few years back because it combined a senior living facility with a childcare. And what they found was there's a mutual benefit to combining spaces for older folks as well as much younger folks, because the younger folks need supervision and the older folks were enjoying the presence of kids. So thinking about cross programming, maybe this could also be a space to invite kids in, play elements and things like that in combination with things for older folks. You can go to the next slide. So that first image on the top left, again, is this idea of the front porch. Moving to a retirement facility may lack some of the comforts of the home that people used to know. So really trying to reimagine what could that front porch be in this kind of setting. And the first type of all ages programming really comes down to seating. And this requires to kind of think beyond, again, the traditional bench or the traditional chair. Think about the different ways and people really like to lounge on their own front porches, whether it be a couch, a chaise lounge, a day bed. There's all sorts of fun ways to reimagine it. So here are a couple examples of seating that really trying to create more of a loungy experience than you often find in a streetscape. Next slide. So if the previous slide is more of those passive activities, looking at all ages programming, that is more active. So I talked before about the integration of space for kids as well as seniors as a potential mutual benefit, and really heightening the idea that play structures don't have to look like play structures. They can be integrated sculptural and artistic elements like the top left image, which creates a very kind of iconic look and feel to it. But there's some additional programming, some ideas include exercise areas that include low impact outdoor gyms. So these could involve some of the items that you see in the bottom two images, more like outdoor gyms for seniors. And then in terms of active programming, I'll touch on this again in a second, but urban gardening is really key. So thinking about how we can design something like an urban gardening facility, whether it's vegetables or just flowers, something that is easy to access and to reach for all people. Next slide. I talked a bit before about different kinds of landscapes that could be incorporated in kind of an all ages and abilities facility, but kind of thinking beyond just all ages and abilities and just thinking about landscapes in general. We typically like to say, oh, a landscape area is a place where we grow trees and we grow shrubs. But there's an opportunity to look at landscapes as functional spaces as well. So the first one, which I touched on before, urban agriculture, incredibly popular in cities. They don't have to be entirely separated areas. They can be creatively worked into the streetscape. This could be beds along the edge of a building or integrated into the space between a sidewalk and where cars might be. And they can also be combined with spaces to gather. So top right image, you see kind of an urban garden that has carved out space for picnicking within it. Next slide. The next type of functional landscape, which is one of my personal favorites, is the idea of landforms. Kind of as we were looking around at the streetscapes along these corridors, these are very flat streetscapes. And while that has some benefits, you can see really far. It also means that if you put in a little topography, you create the opportunity to create a space that is uniquely different from the others and gives you a wide vista to see the things around you. So landforms, little berms with lawns and things like that, they're great for play spaces. So you'll see in some of the future slides ways in which we try to incorporate it within play space. The bottom left image, you can use landforms to creatively frame views. So when we're thinking about some of the areas adjacent to the parks, introducing landforms could actually further support the view to the water. And then I think the biggest thing about landforms is they create more comfortable places for people to sit. So sitting on flat ground is fine. If we think of Post Park as it currently is, it's a very flat space with not a lot of shade. And so introducing things like slope lawns create opportunity for people not only to gather, but in terms of tourists and people visiting the area, they're great opportunities for people to take selfies, to take beautiful photos of the surrounding landscapes. Next slide. And so the last type of functional landscape I'll touch on is green pavement. And so this is just looking at using landscape as a way to substitute where you might normally have asphalt or concrete. Those are most commonly used in parking areas. Both these images are parking areas in cities where you can use a paver system that integrates, doesn't have to be turf, but it could be some form of turf grass or other kinds of low-growing plants with a paving system to create a more ecologically sensitive place for people to park. Next slide. I touched on this yesterday in our presentation, but I wanted to talk a bit further about today, this idea of urban cooling. This is one of the kind of the key things we've been hearing throughout this project is really, in order to make these streets more appealing to all people, there needs to be something to address areas that lack shade, that are subjected to extreme temperatures for extended periods of the year, up to like 8 months of the year. Next slide. And so to test out some of these ideas of urban cooling, really focused in on the block of Evernia between Flagler and Narcissus. So this is where Post Park is in the bottom of the screen, and then you have Meyer Amphitheater at the top right of the screen. And currently this space suffers a little bit from these two green spaces, these two wonderful green spaces from being very disconnected from each other. Post Park feels very isolated. Another reason for this may be that Narcissus in its current alignment, you can see it on the screen. Narcissus comes in straight from above, and then it does a little jog and then comes further down to the south at an angle. So this creates kind of an awkward intersection, makes it a little harder for people to walk directly to cross the street and to move between spaces. Next slide. So what we've looked at doing here is again, working with a two-way shared street kind of concept. This block, we actually looked at the potential of making this something like a pedestrian-only space, but still being able to accommodate loading and delivery because that's much needed for the amphitheater and the function of that entire space. But we really look to like curve and mesh these park spaces into each other so that it doesn't look like a road as much anymore. And it begins to look like two parks trying to come together. So integrated into this main pavement space, you see blue areas, and these blue areas could be play spaces, but they could also be in-ground fountain systems. And these could be for kind of a spray park or more of an urban cooling function. So I wanted to talk about both of those in a moment. Just to kind of finish talking about this, this concept, you'll see amphitheater delivery still needs to be maintained. So everything shown in the hatch pink color and the blue color would still be a semi-hardscape surface, which would allow those delivery vehicles to come in and service those things. But overall, the place would begin to feel a lot more like a park and a plaza. In addition, if we look at potentially realigning Narcissus, which you can see kind of at the bottom left in a gray box, what it does is it creates a lot more space to expand Post Park up towards Narcissus, up towards further up to the west. This creates a little bit more place for potentially play programming. And it also, like I mentioned before, creates a more generous and easy to navigate intersection at Narcissus. Next slide. So here's a look at what that might look like. So some of the things I talked about before, land farms, some earthen berms, places where people can really sit and lean back under a tree and really relax in the space. It no longer looks like a street, begins to look kind of like this park coming out of pavement idea. It also creates a backdrop against the wall of the Meyer Amphitheater loading zone, which is on the left-hand side of the image. It's currently just a wall. And so by putting some form of landform there, you kind of create a backdrop by which people can engage with the space. But one of the key elements in this space is flush-mounted spray park. And so the splashes coming out of the ground. So these can be embedded in the pavement, so cars can drive over it. But when cars aren't in action, there can be sensors that allow this to be set off by kids or even adults who on a very hot day would like to enjoy a much more cooler environment. You can go to the next slide. So 2 uses of water, and they kind of look similar, but they have very different functions within the landscape. The first is this idea of a spray park. Spray park is really about play. It's either about visuals or play. And so this is a larger stream of water often generated from the ground. So if you're a kid in a swimsuit, you can run through it. If it's motion activated, it's responding to your body and your movement, creates that cool summertime play atmosphere. And I love the middle image. I think this one really captures a way in which this kind of feature, which is very, very playful, could also be integrated into perhaps a space where adults are passing through or walking. It could be integrated into something that slightly resembles a streetscape by creating this canopy of water. Next slide. So if the spray park is more for play, misting elements are more focused on cooling and creating environments where you can do other things than just play. So misters can be embedded into the ground, but I like all of these images because they really show the way in which misting elements can be embedded in things like light posts or sculptures or potentially even building facades. And so what this creates, like in the left-hand image, is a space where maybe this is a seating area for people to dine. There's an adjacent misting system, really helps cool down the microclimate in that specific location and heightens the ability for people to enjoy sitting at the table in the heat of the summer. Next slide. So I'm going to close just talking about digital tools, and I'll be talking about them a bit in combination with wayfinding. Both these things really relate strongly to mobility. We're exploring digital tools as its own category, but a lot of the ways in which we use digital tools is to get around, whether we're using our smartphones to find a place we're going, to figure out when the bus is coming. It's very closely linked to our sense of where we are in a city. So some of the ways in which I explored wayfinding and digital tools was on this block of Evernia, just up the street from the last concept I showed. This is between Narcissus and Olive. And so on the south side of the block here, there's a retirement living condominium. And this features actually a 4 or 5 foot high wall along that edge. So currently that makes it a little less inviting of a pedestrian environment. There's no doors activating, no shops activating that side. So we really look to the north side of the street in terms of where we might want to create more space for people to be and for people to potentially linger. The north side of the street features both residential and commercial along the block. Next slide. So this is the most constrained block within the Datura and Evernia study corridors. So available space is a bit less of a thing here. So we had to think creatively about how to create enough space to invite people to linger on that north side while still allowing a generous sidewalk on the south side of the street. And so the idea was really to create small parklets along the north side. These could respond to whatever is happening inside the building. So on the easternmost end, there's currently a bar there. So thinking about a parklet that creates dining or commercial opportunity, and thinking about not necessarily all the commercial there that is currently there, potentially future commercial that may be there. Additional parklets could bounce along that northern facade to create those opportunities. But the two main features on this street, the first one on the north side is this long linear shade structure. This is because the north side gets a lot more heat and direct light. Both the buildings fronting the street are bright and white. So there's a lot of just heat bouncing around here. So thinking about a long linear shade structure along that edge was one of the things we were proposing. And then on that southern edge, where I was talking about the vertical wall of the residential building, looking to create a green wall along that residential edge and create something more of a promenade. If the north side of the street here is a place to linger and sit and stay, the south side of the street can be a place to travel through. So for people traveling to the water, this might be, if you don't want to go to any of the businesses on this block, this might be a place to really walk through. So we looked at creative ways to integrate some digital tools and wayfinding to really create this kind of promenade sense in the space. You go to the next slide. So using, on the left side, you see these vertical posts. We really like the idea of posts because posts create identifiable landmarks that can be repeated throughout the landscape. So even if you're not from the area, even if you don't know where this street goes, if you see the repetition of these landmark elements down the street, it becomes a cue to you as a user that this is a place to travel through. The post can also host different forms of wayfinding. So they can host banners that communicate events, communicate the name of the street. Within that, they can include some digital tools embedded in that, things like QR codes that let people know about the events. These posts can also serve as lighting, and they can serve as Wi-Fi towers for local public Wi-Fi. Another aspect of this kind of linear wayfinding, the use of a shade canopy as shown on the right, really creates this straight visual but bold identifier that functions very similar to these light posts on the left. This creates this kind of linear promenading down the street. Again, lets you know if you're coming from the water side or if you're coming from the city side that there's something to pass through here. You can hit the next slide. This is another block that really showcases a few of the other digital tools that you might see. One is the bike share, locating that in locations where people might be coming and going. But again, that is a form of a digital tool. People using their smartphones to not only locate, but also to get a mobility device, whether it's a bike or an e-bike or something like that. There's also restaurant interfacing. More and more delivery for restaurants is happening by bike, and people more and more really enjoy walk-up windows and the ability to kind of grab and go food. So thinking about how the streetscape can accommodate that kind of commercial activity, which is very much a digital activity, creating spaces for people to queue or pick up foods, or even to order in the street. Sensors might be in reaction to climate elements. So on a very hot day, there may be sensors that trigger shade systems along buildings to help cool down the buildings. It could also help trigger awnings to come out along restaurant fronts. And then lastly, public Wi-Fi, which I mentioned before briefly, but public Wi-Fi creates another reason for people to really hang out in space. And if you're trying to activate an otherwise dead space, especially in a district that might have more offices or people who work, Wi-Fi is a very powerful way to create that opportunity in space. Next slide. So this is kind of referencing back a couple slides to that previous collage of the street. But you can see the image on the left really highlights these vertical posts. They serve as this linear wayfinding element that can integrate all these different features within them, including lighting. The middle image is the power of color and the power of linear elements that pull you through a space. This example is a sculptural bench that folds and forms to create canopies, but as you're in the space, you know exactly where you're headed because you have this red line pulling you all the way through. And then the image on the right, something very classic and somewhat traditional, the idea of kind of the street gateway. So really announcing your presence to a street, whether you're coming from the city side, maybe from the station over at Quadro, or you're coming from the waterfront. Some kind of sense of arrival or entry in the form of a gateway signage could be very beneficial. Next slide. So just kind of closing up with a few more looks at types of digital tools. The image on the left kind of shows a few different ways in which we could have sensors in the landscape. These kind of sculptural elements could be showing off the local time, but they could be showing off air quality. They should be showing off real-time weather. And the image on the right, which is one we want to explore a bit more, is the idea of transportation. So having live trackers of buses and trains could be located at key locations to show people who are taking transit, who may not be from the area or who need to commute into or out of the area, to show them the real-time availability of trains or buses around. And I believe that's all, and I'm not sure who we're throwing it next.
All right. Thanks, Donnie. That was great. A lot of great ideas that are being formed here that can be applied to in all different ways to all sorts of blocks that we're dealing with. All right, so here we're talking about community activation. Essentially what that means is programming of these two corridors in multiple different ways, using multiple elements. Next slide, please. Here are just some different ideas about what you would want to program and the tools you can use to program, all things that can bring the community together through the way that you design the space. Next slide, please. So I'm going to be showing off some of our team members' work here. A study done by Ecosistema Urbano was done that was focusing on the alleys that we are looking at essentially, just parallel to our corridors here of Datura and Evernia. This one is shown directly north of Datura, and it's still an alley that exists pretty much in its entirety today. I believe it's wide enough that you can drive through, and there's a lot of potential for these alleys and how you can activate them, especially with the interactions of the businesses and buildings around it. So a lot of these slides that I'm about to show are just different ideas about how you can interact with these alleys. This one's suggesting lunch. And next slide, please. This one is suggesting having a book night, and utilizing this part of the alley to activate it and to linger in to do that. Next slide, please. And again, using that idea of maybe progressing through the whole alley to go on a walking book tour and utilize the whole space for what it is. Next slide, please. And then utilizing this space that we know is going to be a mixed-use facility for older folks, This was prior to knowing that, and this idea was around how can we make a parking lot more activated and use it for a playground and accessing it that way. Next slide, please. And then this is engaging the corridor along Datura that has all of the shops and excuse me, I'm forgetting the word for right now, cafes and places to eat, restaurants, excuse me, and engaging that. There are these smaller alleys that go through it. So this is showing how you can connect to the larger one that is parallel to Datura and move through to these spaces. Next slide, please. Fitness trail is another engaging way to get community members together, especially if you're interested in running groups and need a starting point to do that in. Next slide, please. And talking about having another place to, again, go to a movie theater and to have a place to meet before you do that and after it, talk about the movie and just linger among those spaces. Next slide, please. So the next thing that we're going to look at is also in talking about the alleys. And it also relates to our corridors in just ways that site furniture can be used, just like community activation can be used not only in the alleys, but with our streetscapes as well. So this is talking about lighting and how you can create some really interesting lighting effects that happen in the alley, as well as on our streetscapes. Next slide, please. This is looking at something similar to what Donnie was talking about with the comfort of your landscapes interacting with your streetscape and how you can use those cooling effects. In this case, we're looking at how movable objects and furniture can help to do that. You see a canopy here that's made out of plants and these movable large planters that can have a real effect on your cooling systems without them being extremely as permanent as a streetscape tree. Next slide, please. Here we're looking at lots of different treatments, including pavement and painting, and just bringing the whole space together as a cohesive, in a cohesive feel, whether that's the facade and the way you interact with it. You can see that there are different symbols on here, and it really allows you to engage in the space and use it in different ways. And in the image to the left, you can see even some people rock climbing and the idea of canopies and just using the space for everything that it is, whether that's high or low. Next slide, please. Here, this is, again, getting a little bit at what Donnie was talking about with the digital interaction, being able to use our spaces in a cohesive way for connectivity and how we can really engage people with what the space is offering. So this is showing not only the digital component, but the movable site furniture to really get people to interact, not just on their phones, but to interact with the space, have a place to sit and talk, and maybe rearrange the furniture as they see fit for what's going on with what they're talking about and what they're doing. Next slide, please. And this is another just cool idea, and it is a photo sim of the alley that we were looking at earlier next to Datura, and just how it can be imagined, how you can use building facades and pavement and overhead structures and lighting all in one to create this really cool space that will allow you to want to use that community activation, stay in the space and make it a space you want to be, whereas right now it might be back of house. But this can again be applied to our streetscapes of Datura and Evernia in very similar ways, even though we're dealing with wider corridors where you don't necessarily have such a narrow facade on each side. You could still recreate these elements in different ways that apply more to a wider corridor. Next slide, please. So here's another idea of not only furniture, but something very showy as signs to introduce your city or introduce a concept. They're sculptural, and you know, a lot of cities have them, but they always make an impact, and there are always different ways to do it. They're really fun for people to interact with and can be used as furniture so people can just hang out there. But it's also a really good way to showcase your area and get people interacting with it in a way that engages social media as well. People love taking pictures next to it. So it can be a great advertisement for tourism in a lot of ways, or just to increase the pride of your area. Next slide, please. And this is, again, something similar to that last concept, where you can play around with these sculptural elements, integrate symbolic ideas into either the furniture or, again, facades, just sneaking in those kind of hidden elements that people can sneak up upon and feel like they're discovering it for the first time, and also interacting with it. Next slide, please. Yes, next slide, please. So these are our temporary intervention slides. Here we're going to talk a little bit about what we've been looking at these past couple of days, and especially the two-way concept that in which you would not move the curbs, kind of what that looks like in a temporary way. These concepts can be both permanent or temporary depending on what is desired for the corridors. But in this way, we're going to look at it with the temporary lens. And as you can see, you know, we're looking at spaces that can be used in multiple different ways. This is looking at Quadrille de Dixie on Evernia. And you can see that there's parking on the north side of the street, but on the south side of the street, there's plenty of room for parklets. And Donnie did talk a little bit about parklets and what that could look like. But these are areas that can be used in multiple different ways, whether that is to extend the streetscape and to add furniture so that people can casually sit. Again, that idea of movable furniture that we were seeing before. Or it can be more permanent feel seating that can really play to the businesses around it. So we're seeing that here with this mixed-use building that is the frontage to Evernia in this block, and how that can really tie into really interacting people, letting them have a place to stay and engage with these businesses and each other, and also connect more readily to the residential building across the street. Adding another crosswalk and perhaps making it a fun crosswalk, not just your typical high visibility crosswalk, but making it fun and unique, and perhaps making it changeable, making it temporary so that you can get creative with it and change it every so many years if desired. Next slide, please. So this is just envisioning those ideas on this block. Again, you can see that movable furniture, some temporary that you can see, and some overhead facades that we talked about a little earlier with adding that canopy element, a cooling element that you can see here. Next slide, please. All right, I think this is perhaps Emily's slide.
Thanks, Chloe. So the last theme we'll talk about today with this project is the idea of creating a linear park or a green corridor with the streets. So not just gray hardscaping and focused on vehicle throughput, but also taking the idea of place and just extending it the entirety of the street. Next slide, please. So this graphic is showing Datura Street and some of the ideas that we're thinking about for the street. And above it is just showing how this idea is leveraging existing green spaces and kind of connecting them with continuous green space with the sidewalk. So not just a plain concrete sidewalk, but also incorporating elements that you might find in a park. So programming and activation, furniture, art, landscaping, and other fun elements that really dress up the space. Next slide, please. This slide focuses on the block of Datura from Dixie to Olive Street, and it is demonstrating what happens when you can kind of condense the amount of public space on one side. So this scenario is specifically looking at a one-way conversion of the two streets. So eastbound on Datura to reach the waterfront and the amphitheater, and then westbound on Evernia. You get a lot of extra space when you only have the one travel lane, and we are just looking at what happens if you focus a lot of that on, let's say, the north side. This kind of creates a linear park, kind of a passageway where you can have a meandering path instead of just a straight sidewalk going along the block. And as it meanders, it creates pockets where you can fit in furniture and other forms of activation. So this block in particular, it kind of responds to the adjacent land uses. So there's lots of offices and commercial uses in this block. So we thought it could be a great opportunity to include shaded seating areas that people could take their lunch breaks on or a phone call. We also are exploring the idea of incorporating other elements that Donnie and Chloe talked about, such as Wi-Fi outside, so you can work outside on a nice day, art, or a hard, shady structure. We're envisioning that this space feels like just like a long park full of landscaping and beautiful gardens and trees. That is just really an enjoyable experience to walk down. Next, please. And this is just a rendering of what that street could look like if you had a lot of green space on the north side. On the left is another version, is a precedent image of what that looks like in practice. So you have a meandering path. You can even do multiple paths. So it's a slower experience, not focused on getting the pedestrian from one side of the block to the other. It's more about an experience. And here we're also showing raised planters. Maybe you could incorporate retaining walls that you can sit on. And we're also utilizing the vacant lot behind the sidewalk on the north side, which is the left of this picture, that maybe food trucks could park at during lunch and service the people who work in the adjacent buildings. Next. This is the block of Narcissus and Flagler. As the linear park kind of moves to the east, it kind of turns from a place, the land uses kind of evolve and transform and kind of become more active. So this is looking at a shared street concept that can kind of activate in the same way that the park will activate. The road itself kind of meanders down to Flagler, and there's room for food trucks and seating areas. The restaurants that exist on this block could have outdoor dining spaces and shade structures. Next slide, please. And this is a rendering of what that might look like. Here we're playing with the idea of artistic shade structures. That's these kind of translucent pieces floating in the air a little bit. We're kind of imagining them as like beach umbrellas, and maybe there's sand next to the road and other fun artistic elements and seating areas. Next, please. And this in this block is Evernia from Dixie to Olive as well. And it's going westbound away from the waterfront, but there's still an opportunity to continue the linear park. And this is just showing how you can also incorporate wayfinding, outdoor dining into the streetscape and those park elements. Next slide, please. And this is a rendering of that street facing east. On the right, you have the brewery, which we are saying that we should formalize the dining space, expand the landscaped areas, and add in shade trees to really cool the street down as much as possible. Next.
Great, thank you, Emily. Well, hopefully this gives everyone an idea of some of the unifying elements that we are exploring across all three scenarios. Tomorrow, we are going to work on pulling all three scenarios together with some of these concepts to provide a cohesive, vision of each scenario. And we'll be following that up with a survey that everyone can take to start to get feedback from the community in terms of, what elements do you like? What kinds of, features, do we need to incorporate? Should we explore one way or two way? And then work towards the final design after the shred. Tomorrow's agenda, unlike the past 3 days, there will be no virtual open studios, and we will be focusing on preparing for the final presentation tomorrow, same time as today, 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. And like I mentioned, tomorrow we'll also be pulling together an online survey where you can explore these concepts in a little more detail, and then provide the design team feedback on what features and scenarios you like the best. I'll also say again, if you haven't had a chance, please take the interactive online survey, and you can find a link to the survey on the project's website at reimaginingdaturaandevernia.com. And you can also find information and continue to follow along for live streaming on the project's Facebook page at facebook.com/Datura and Evernia. So thank you everyone for your time and attention, and we look forward to sharing more details about concepts tomorrow.